I've spent most of my adult life believing the hardest promises are the big ones, the kind you make with witnesses, papers, signatures. Turns out the most dangerous promise I ever made was a quiet one, whispered between two tired breaths when nobody was watching. She held my hand and said, almost like she was asking for something small, "Promise me you'll come back tomorrow." I said I would. I believed it when I said it. Tomorrow was supposed to be easy. 30 years went by instead. I'm telling you this now because this morning, my phone rang while I was standing in the kitchen, staring at a mug that had already gone cold. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. At this age, you learn that most calls don't bring good news, just reminders of things you already know. But I answered. The woman on the other end said my name, the way only one person ever did. Not rushed, not careful. Like she'd known me long enough to be sure I was listening. And just like that, the room felt smaller. The years between then and now folded in on themselves, and I was back in a place I haven't allowed myself to revisit in decades. Back to a night that smelled like disinfectant and weak coffee. Back to a hallway where the lights hummed too loud. Back to the last time she looked at me like she was memorizing my face, just in case. People like to imagine that the moments that change your life announce themselves. That there's music or shouting or some dramatic line you never forget. The truth is quieter. The truth is usually someone asking for something reasonable and you saying yes without understanding the cost. I remember telling myself I had 24 hours. That was the rule. One night, one morning. Then I'd be back. I even pictured it. The sun higher in the sky, her eyes open, me walking in like nothing had been broken. I left because I thought leaving was temporary. That's the lie I lived with. For a long time, I told the story in a way that let me sleep. I said life intervened. I said circumstances shifted. I said timing is cruel, and that's just how things go. If you've lived long enough, you know how easy it is to polish a memory until it stops cutting you. But here's what I never said out loud. I didn't go back the next day, and the longer I waited, the harder tomorrow became. There are entire versions of myself that exist only because I didn't keep that promise. Jobs I took, cities I stayed in, conversations I never had because they would have required explaining why I wasn't where I said I'd be. If you're still listening, stay with me a little longer. Not because this story has answers, but because some promises don't expire. They just get heavier with time. When that woman said her name on the phone today, I realized something I've been avoiding for 30 years. This wasn't a story about something I lost. It was about something I never finished. And if you've ever carried a moment like that with you, the kind you don't talk about but never forget, you might want to hear what happened next. We didn't meet in a way people like to romanticize later. No story you'd tell at a dinner party. No moment that would survive a highlight reel. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind you don't remember unless something quietly attaches itself to it. I was killing time in a small place just off the highway, one of those spots where the coffee is always too hot and the menu hasn't changed in 20 years. Trucks came and went outside the window. Nobody stayed longer than they had to, except her. She was sitting alone, facing the glass instead of the door. Everyone else watched for someone to arrive. She watched people leave. That struck me as backward in a way I couldn't explain. I asked if the seat across from her was taken. She looked up, took half a second longer than necessary, then smiled and said no. Not apologetic, not polite, just sure. We talked about nothing worth remembering. The weather, how the air felt heavier than it should have been, how coffee always tasted better at home, no matter how bad it was. The kind of conversation adults use to feel each other out without giving anything away. But the thing that stayed with me was how she listened. She didn't rush me, didn't fill space just to prove she was there. When I trailed off mid-sentence, she didn't rescue me. She waited, like she trusted I'd come back to my own point. Most people don't do that. After a while, I noticed I was sitting differently, leaning in without realizing it, letting my hands rest instead of fidgeting, saying things the long way. At some point, she said almost casually, "You always stir your coffee even when it's already mixed." I laughed and asked how long she'd been watching me. "Long enough," she said, and went back to her cup. That should have made me uncomfortable. Instead, it felt familiar. We didn't exchange numbers that day, didn't promise to see each other again. We just nodded when we stood up, like people who assume the world will cross their paths again if it needs to. It did. Over the next few weeks, we kept running into each other in ways that felt accidental until they didn't. 10 minutes here, a shared booth there, once just standing outside while rain threatened but never quite fell. We never named what we were doing. We didn't need to. She remembered small things, not the impressive kind, the practical ones, that I always checked the exits before sitting down, that I went quiet when people talked about the future like it was guaranteed. She said she could tell how my day had gone by how long I took to answer simple questions. I asked her once how she noticed things like that. She shrugged and said, "I pay attention when something feels temporary." That word stuck. Temporary. One evening we were sitting in her room, the TV on low, neither of us watching. She folded her hands in her lap the way people do when they're about to say something that costs them. She told me she hated goodbyes. Not because they were sad, she said, but because people treated them like conclusions. Like saying goodbye meant something was finished, sealed, archived. Most things don't end, she said quietly. They just stop being spoken out loud. I brushed it off, said something careless about her thinking too much, about life being simpler than that. She didn't argue. She just looked at me for a moment longer than usual, like she was deciding whether to let me stay wrong. Then she said, "You'll understand later." I didn't. Not then. Years after everything else, long after I'd convinced myself I understood how the story went, I found something that made my stomach drop. It was inside an old book I hadn't opened since I moved out of that apartment. A thin slip of paper, folded twice, worn soft like it had been handled more than it should have been. I knew what it was before I unfolded it. The note was short, careful, written in her steady handwriting, the kind that didn't lean too far in any direction. She thanked me for coming when I did. She said some things are only meant to last the length they last. And at the bottom, a line I had somehow forgotten until that moment. "Please don't come back tomorrow." I sat there with the paper in my hands, listening to the house make its usual noises, realizing how many years I'd lived without ever questioning that sentence. Because suddenly, the version of the story I'd told myself made sense. She hadn't been waiting. She'd been letting me go. And if that were true, then maybe the promise I broke wasn't a failure at all. Maybe it was exactly what she wanted. And that possibility settled in my chest like something unfinished, asking to be examined more closely than I was ready for. For a while after I found that note, I treated it like a verdict, not something to question, something to accept. It was easier that way. Cleaner. The sentence explained too much too neatly, and I let it. It explained the silence, the distance, the way my life had moved forward without ever looping back to her. I told myself this was what closure felt like when you were old enough to recognize it. But closure, real closure, doesn't itch. This did. It showed up in quiet moments. Late at night, when the house settled and every sound felt louder than it should. Driving familiar roads and missing turns because my mind drifted somewhere else. Folding laundry and realizing I'd stopped halfway through a shirt, just standing there, staring at nothing. So I started asking questions, not the dramatic kind, just practical ones. The kind you can justify to yourself without admitting you're still looking for someone who's been gone for 30 years. I went back to the hospital first. It didn't look like the place I remembered. New paint, softer lighting, signs designed to calm people down before they had a reason to panic. I stood at the front desk longer than necessary, rehearsing what I'd say like it mattered. The woman behind the counter was young, polite. Her voice had that careful tone people use when they don't know if you're about to ask for directions or bad news. I gave her a name, a year, a date range wide enough to feel reasonable. She typed for a while, frowning slightly, then shook her head, said records from that long ago were limited. Some digital, some paper, some lost to time. I nodded like I expected that. Before I left, I asked a question I hadn't planned on asking. I asked if anyone had come back asking about her before. She paused, then said, "Not that I know of." The drive from the hospital took longer than it should have. Traffic I didn't remember. Stoplights that seemed determined to turn red just as I reached them. By the time I pulled into the motel lot, the sun was lower than I'd expected. The building was still there. New sign, same bones. I recognized the soda machine by the ice bin immediately. It made the same low hum, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. I stood there longer than I needed to, trying to remember which room I'd stayed in, like that detail might unlock something important. An older man was cleaning the office window. Slow, deliberate movements, the kind that come from doing the same thing for years. I asked if he'd worked there long. He looked at me, considered the question, then said, "Long enough." I told him the year, told him I was trying to remember someone who might have stayed nearby. I didn't give details, just enough to see if anything landed. He squinted, nodded once, and said, "Yeah, I remember her." My chest tightened. "She was quiet," he said. "Polite. Always asked what time it was when she checked in." I asked why that stood out. "Because there was a clock right there," he said, pointing behind him. "That felt like her." I asked if she'd been waiting for someone. He nodded. "Yeah, she said so." I waited. When I asked if anyone ever came back for her, he hesitated, just long enough to matter. "Not that I saw," he said, "but she told me not to worry about it." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he said. Not that I saw. Not, "Don't worry, he's not coming." Just, "Don't worry about it." I thanked him and walked away before I could ask something that would make this real in a way I wasn't ready for. The last conversation came from someone I hadn't expected to find, a retired nurse whose name I remembered the moment I heard it, even though I hadn't spoken it in decades. She answered the phone cautiously, like someone who'd learned not every call was good news. She didn't remember me. Why would she? But when I said her name, she repeated it slowly, like she was opening a file she hadn't touched in years. "Oh," she said. "Yes, I remember her." I asked what she remembered most. "That she was calm," the nurse said, "and that she kept asking if everyone else was okay." I asked if she'd left any messages. The nurse said yes, nothing written, just something she'd asked to be passed along if I came back. "She said to tell you thank you," the nurse said, "and that you should go on with your life." I waited for more. When I asked if she'd said anything else, the nurse paused. "Well," she said, "she did ask if you'd be all right." That was it. No urgency, no correction, no insistence that I come back tomorrow. I ended the call sitting in my car, engine off, hands on the wheel, staring at a street I'd driven down 1,000 times without really seeing. By the time I went home, the conclusion felt settled. She hadn't been waiting. She'd been preparing. Preparing herself. Preparing me. Preparing an ending that wouldn't tear either of us apart more than necessary. And if that was true, then the promise she made me give wasn't hope. It was goodbye, wrapped in kindness so I wouldn't question it. That night, I took the note out again. "Please don't come back tomorrow." I read it until the words lost their shape. For the first time in 30 years, I believed I finally understood her. And that understanding hurt more than not knowing ever had. I would have let it end there if not for one small thing that refused to stay quiet. It came back to me a few days later, while I was folding laundry of all things. An ordinary moment. The kind where your hands are busy and your mind drifts where it wants. I was holding an old shirt I should have thrown away years ago when I remembered her correcting me once, gently, about a word I'd used. I'd said tomorrow like it was a destination. She'd said it like a condition. The difference didn't matter then, it mattered now. So I went back to the note, not to read it, but to look at it, really look at it. The creases, the pressure of the pen, the places where the ink paused just slightly before continuing. There was a smudge near the last line. I'd always assumed it was age or my own hands, but the more I stared at it, the more it looked like hesitation, like someone stopping mid-thought, then choosing their words carefully. "Please don't come back tomorrow." Not never. Not don't come back, just tomorrow. That distinction hit me harder than I expected. I called the retired nurse again. I apologized for bothering her. Told her there was one thing I needed to be sure about. I asked her if she remembered the exact wording of the message she'd passed along all those years ago. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I remember thinking it was strange." I asked her why. "Because she corrected herself," the nurse said. She started to say one thing, then stopped, changed it. My grip tightened on the phone. She said, "If he comes back tomorrow," the nurse continued, "tell him thank you." Then she paused, and she said, "No, tell him to go live." I sat down hard. That wasn't a dismissal, that was timing. The nurse went on, her voice softer now. She said the doctors had told her the morning would be difficult, that visitors were discouraged, that sometimes hope, when it shows up at the wrong moment, makes things harder, not better. She didn't want you remembering her like that, the nurse said. She was very clear. Very clear. I realized then how badly I'd wanted the simpler story. The one where she chose the ending and closed the door so I wouldn't have to wonder if I failed her. But the truth was heavier. She hadn't released me from the promise. She'd postponed it. Tomorrow wasn't a future she could guarantee. It was a moment she was trying to protect us both from. All those years, I'd carried her words like a rejection because it hurt less than admitting she was thinking of me right up to the end. That she was still managing the damage, still deciding how much pain each of us would have to carry. I'd mistaken care for distance. I'd mistaken restraint for goodbye. And suddenly, the phone call from that morning made sense in a way I wasn't ready for. Because if she never meant for tomorrow to be the end, then maybe the promise hadn't been broken. Maybe it had just been waiting. Waiting for a version of me old enough to understand why she'd asked in the first place. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at a street I'd lived on for years without really seeing. For the first time since that night 30 years ago, I didn't feel accused by the past. I felt invited, and that changed everything about what I needed to do next. I went back on a Tuesday. I didn't plan it that way. It just happened. I looked at the calendar that morning and realized Tuesdays don't pretend to be anything special. They don't carry hope or dread. They don't announce change. They just exist. That felt right. The drive took less time than I remembered. Or maybe I'd spent 30 years making it longer in my head. The road signs looked familiar, but distant, like faces you recognize before remembering names. I passed the diner near the edge of town. Same building. New paint that didn't quite stick to the corners. I slowed down, considered pulling in, then decided not to. Some things are better acknowledged in passing. The building where she'd stayed was quiet. No sense of arrival, no emotional swell, just a place doing what it had always done, standing still while people moved through it. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there longer than necessary. 30 years ago, I'd rushed out of this lot with a head full of tomorrows. This time, I walked. I noticed things I hadn't before: the uneven concrete, the sound of traffic somewhere beyond the trees, a faint breeze moving through the leaves like it was checking in. Behind the building, there was a small courtyard I'd never seen, a bench under partial shade, nothing remarkable. And yet, it felt deliberate, like the kind of place someone might choose if they wanted a moment that didn't ask for anything back. I sat down. I didn't say her name out loud. I didn't need to. Some conversations don't require sound, to be honest. I thought about the man I'd been when I left. How confident he was that time could be negotiated with. How sure he'd been that leaving didn't count as loss if you planned to return. I thought about how carefully she'd spoken, how she'd held the weight of tomorrow so I wouldn't have to hold the weight of goodbye, how she'd chosen restraint over reassurance, knowing one would hurt less in the long run. And I understood finally that keeping a promise isn't always about showing up on a specific day. Sometimes it's about showing up with the right understanding. I stayed there a while, long enough for the light to shift, long enough for the quiet to stop feeling empty and start feeling complete. When I stood up, something inside me loosened, not disappeared, just softened, like a knot you stop pulling against. Before I left, I did something I hadn't planned. I took the note out of my pocket. The paper was thinner than I remembered, softer. It had lived a life of its own, folded and unfolded across decades. I read it once more, not for meaning this time, just for familiarity. Then I folded it again and placed it between the pages of the book I'd brought with me, not to hide it, not to preserve it, just to let it rest somewhere honest. On the drive home, I didn't rush. I stopped when I needed to, let a few cars pass me, let the road be what it was instead of what I wanted it to be. That night, back in my own house, I noticed something small but important. The quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. I didn't feel closure the way movies promise it. No swelling music, no final line that ties everything into a clean bow. What I felt was peace. The kind that comes when you stop arguing with the past and finally listen to what it was trying to tell you all along. Tomorrow, I realized, was never a date. It was an agreement. An understanding that some things don't end when we think they do. They wait, they age, they change shape. And if we're lucky, they wait long enough for us to be ready. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you. I'd really like to know which part of this stayed with you the longest. And if stories like this matter to you, the quiet ones that don't shout but stay, you're welcome to come back tomorrow.